So good evening, everyone. My name is Ruth von Bernus, and I'm the director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the annual lecture on Sephardic Judaism, and we thank very much an anonymous donor who gave a generous gift to the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. Major gifts have played an important role in what we've been able to accomplish over the last years. But so has annual giving, and we owe a great debt to all the alumni and friends who have supported us. I thank each and every one of you for your support. And now it's a very special pleasure for me to introduce you the speaker tonight, Michael Figueroa. He is the Associate Director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and that's the reason why I very closely work with him. He joined us at UNC in 2014 after completing his PhD from the University of Chicago. His research is focused on music, politics, and religion in the modern Middle East, with a specialty in Israeli-Palestinian crisis. He's the author of several articles that have appeared or will soon appear in journals such as Ethnomusicology Forum, and the Journal of Musicology, as well as in several edited volumes, including one for which he served as editor alongside UNC colleague Annegret Fauser. That book is called Performing Commemoration, Musical Reenactment and the Politics of Trauma, and appeared on the Music and Social Justice series of the University of Michigan Press last year. We will place a link to that book in the chat. His first single-authored book, City of Song, Music and the Making of Modern Jerusalem, will be published later this year by Oxford University Press. And now let me welcome you, Mike Figueroa, and whenever you have questions during his talk, please use already the Q&A, and we will then have time after his talk to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Hope you all can hear me well. Before I get started, I'm just going to pull up my slides for you. Okay, first I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies for inviting me to deliver this talk and to express my gratitude to the Center's Board of Directors and other community members for their support for what we do here. What we're going to do today is twofold. One, we're going to explore how the memory of an important medieval figure, philosopher, poet Yehuda Halevi, figures into the ideological landscape of modern Zionism. And two, to suggest a methodological imperative for Jewish studies to take music seriously and to ask ourselves, what stories might music tell us? Let's start with the former, but move quickly to music so we can get some beautiful sounds in your ears. Yehuda Halevi was one of the most prolific poets of medieval Iberia and in the history of Jewish literature. Emerging as an icon for the cultural flourishing of Andalusian Jewish life within the Haskalah and the development of modern Zionism since the late 19th century, Halevi's memory has often represented the archetypal Mediterranean journey to Jerusalem, the traditional object of Jewish diasporic longing. It is not surprising, therefore, that his poems have provided powerful lyrical and symbolic material for a number of Israeli musicians. As I will show, these musical settings of his poetry reveal some of the ways that, as my Hebrew University colleague Tanya Sermer points out, Zionism is not a monolithic ideology, but a field of contestation. The differing uses and interpretations of Halevi's legacy reveal a variety of political agendas and orientations to space. In what follows, I analyze a few examples of Israeli musical Mediterraneanism in the context of musical settings of Halevi's poetry, in order to demonstrate how crucial these texts, and by extension, memories of Al-Andalus more broadly, have been to the reimagination of exile in Israeli modernity. Israeli musical settings of Halevi's poetry betray the easy illusion of the poet's exilic attachment to the Holy Land in Jerusalem, with specific ideological needs of several strands of Zionism that lay territorial claim to it. Musicians have done this by ensounding exile through Mediterranean musical gestures that locate Halevi's words within their original Andalusian context, called Sefarad in Hebrew. The popular song Yefe Nof, meaning "Oh Beautiful," is particularly illustrative of this phenomenon. The original poem is brief, but intimate and saturated with biblical imagery. "O beautiful joy of the world, city of the great king, my soul longed for you from the edge of the west. If only I could be endowed with your stones and be restored and taste your clods. To my mouth it would be sweet as honey." The phrase Yefe Nof, which literally translates to beautiful view or landscape or vista, or here as "Oh beautiful," is also a traditional nickname for the city of Jerusalem in the Hebrew Bible, specifically in the third line of Psalm 48. I should say line 3, by the way, in that little parenthetical. "Fair in situation, the joy of the whole earth, even Mount Zion, the uttermost parts of the north, the city of the great king." Nechama Hindel originally performed Halevi's Yefe Nof at the 1965 Israeli Song Festival held at Jerusalem's Binyanei HaUmah Convention Center, and recorded it to be included on multiple albums appearing in the aftermath of the Six-Day War of 1967, when Israel conquered and occupied several territories, including the Old City of Jerusalem. Her recording was released on her own 1967 album, Ve'ulai, or And Maybe, and on multiple Jerusalem song compilation albums that appeared between 67 and 68 to commemorate the state of Israel's newfound control over the city. Hindel's arrangement of the song, produced in collaboration... I'm jumped the gun there. Produced in collaboration with composer Yanon Ne'eman, corroborates this emotional language, the emotional language of the song text itself. I'd like you to listen here for a sparse texture, moments of rubato, or I guess it could be called time smearing, and interplay between the singer's voice and its accompaniment. You'll hear Handel's voice intone Halevi's words unaccompanied for the first line, at the end of which, on the word rav, or great, a lone guitar enters, creating a moment of drama at the song's outset. Her effective use of vocal rubato to emphasize specific moments of profound poetic meaning in the text was typical of her performance style during the mid-1960s and beyond. Okay, let's give this a listen.
Yefenov mesos tevel kiryale melech rav Yefenov mesos tevel kiryale melech rav lehanich sefa nafshi mipatem
Stop it there. I'd love to listen to the whole thing, but we don't have time. So on her guitar, Hindel plucks what's called a habanera rhythm and counterpoint between the thumb and the fingers, with repeated cadences that are called Phrygian cadences that are stereotypical of Spanish musical folklore and flamenco presented on the world stage. By drawing on these sonic signifiers of Spain, Hindel's vocal and instrumental gestures underscore Halevi's exilic condition, using the contemporary exoticism and multicultural nostalgia that in Israel is associated with his homeland, Al-Andalus. The musical framing of Halevi as an icon of exile here and in many other songs of the period, serves to suggest that the idea that the poet-philosopher himself aligned with and perhaps even presaged Zionist conceptions of exile and homeland, for the musical setting casts his longing for Zion as a historicized longing, projected into a past and at a distance that ultimately will be overcome by Jewish return. Handel's rendition of the song is a way of examining exile at close range while celebrating its distance from the current state of affairs in which Jews occupy their ancestral homeland. In order to understand the genealogy of this idea, it will be important to examine the historical process of Halevi's rediscovery in modernity and his subsequent metamorphosis into a proto-Zionist figure. What stories music tells, indeed. Many historians have understood medieval Iberia to have hosted a golden age of cultural production that flourished under Islamic political formations that governed Muslim, Jewish, and in some cases Christian communities in southern Iberia, while others have taken issue with the mythologization of these relations. The Golden Age view is to some extent a product of proto-Zionist thought. As ethnomusicologist Ruth Davis observes, quote, Enlightenment Jewish historians viewed Al-Andalus as a paradigm of religious tolerance, equality, and secular cross-cultural interaction. Crucially, they used it as a model and precedent for contemporary European Jewish emancipation, end of quote. In other words, European Jewish thinkers created a historical narrative that served the ends of urgent contemporary politics, in line with a broader pattern of shaping the memory of Al-Andalus according to what Dwight Reynolds has called proto-nationalist agendas. In many ways, the mythologization of Al-Andalus worked hand in hand with the mythologization of ancient Israelite society as a narrative authenticating modern Jewish settlement of the territory. Both bolstered modern claims of Jewish attachment to the land using deeply rooted expressions of exile, layered with pathos and religiosity stemming from their ritual function, both in diaspora and in Palestine and later Israel. The revival of Andalusian music and poetry, especially poetry written by Yehuda Halevi, played a critical role in this process. Halevi's renown as a poet is a relatively recent phenomenon. During the 7 centuries between his mid-12th century death and the Haskalah, Halevi was known primarily for his philosophical magnum opus, the Kuzari, a creative and methodical defense of Judaism based on an apocryphal tale of the conversion of the Khazarite kingdom to Judaism. His poetry was more or less lost to the written record until 1840, when Samuel David Luzado edited and published 66 poems from a diwan, which is a poetry collection of Halevi's poetry recently discovered in Tunis. This was a small portion of the literary trove, and the complete diwan was published in 1864 by Mekizeh Niedlamim, a small, newly established society in East Prussia that was dedicated to the publication of medieval Hebrew literature. It was not until 1894, when Heinrich Brody published a version of the diwan in Berlin, that Halevi's poetry began to circulate in earnest beyond the Mediterranean networks of learning connecting medieval Muslim-ruled cities like Cordoba and Cairo. By the turn of the 20th century, European Jews read and listened to Halevi's poems with great interest, reciting sacred and secular texts alike. Zion Won't You Ask, for example, was recited as a consolatory text during services on Tisha B'Av to commemorate the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, thus recontextualizing Halevi's diasporic longing as a narrative of the destruction of an intact Jewish society into hope for its reconstitution in Palestine, or Eretz Israel. Solomon Schechter's discovery of the Cairo Geniza in 1896 turned up new evidence of Halevi's journey east to Jerusalem and renewed European Jewish interest in appropriating Halevi to serve as a figure of national liberation and attachment to Zion. Furthermore, Franz Rosenzweig's translations, published in 1924 and 1927, were among the first to create a presence for Yehuda Halevi's poetry in the secular Central European Jewish wellspring of political Zionism, a branch of the movement with which Rosenzweig actually often found himself at odds. It is in this light that later thinkers across the spectrum of Zionism would understand Halevi's poetry as being essentially proto-Zionist. As Halevi's biographer Hillel Helkin writes, quote, secular Zionism's keenness to claim Halevi as a precursor fit into its overall project of, quote, Zionizing Jewish history, regarded by it as the long march of a people back to their land, end of quote. This was part of a broader project of historicizing Judaism itself by reading the Bible and other older texts as ancestral history. Halkin gives some weight to this point by demonstrating that Halevi was the first major Jewish figure to call for literal return to Zion without deferment to a Messiah, claiming that he initiated a shift in Jewish cultural production that focused on Eretz Israel and Palestine. That is, he is credited with interpreting the age-old Judaic injunction against forgetting Jerusalem, as articulated in Psalm 137, and the Babylonian exile to which it attests, as a mission for Jews to find themselves once more in terrestrial Zion, rather than only waiting for a heavenly Zion to which they would return at the end of days. Halevi's poetic resurrection from the mid-19th to early 20th centuries was extremely fortuitous, for it helped to propel the distinctly post-Enlightenment Central European romantic nationalism that served as the ideological basis for modern Zionism as a national liberation movement. At the same time, it empowered musicians coming from a spectrum of ethnic identities and political orientations to speak to the larger issues raised by the national culture that flourished as a result of Zionism's success, with Halevi's associations with Mediterranean Al-Andalus also providing a platform for negotiation and critique. Although in many ways, Israeli national culture privileged its European elements during its formative decades, the country's musical practice is indelibly marked by the Mediterranean Sea. This is first and foremost because of Israel's large population of people who immigrated via complex Mediterranean routes, along with the pre-existing populations of Jews and non-Jews alike who were indigenous to Ottoman Palestine and established traditions there over many generations. Those who migrated from Mediterranean locales brought with them long-standing liturgical and secular traditions that employed the aesthetics and modal and rhythmic structures common to the broader societies in which they developed. Ensembles such as the Israeli Andalusian Orchestra, founded by Casablanca-born composer Avi Elam Amzalag, have brokered the Andalusian musical heritage. My slides are out of order, my apologies. The Andalusian musical heritage to national and international audiences. These projects have often taken on a political valence. For example, the Israeli Andalusian Orchestra, who in their marketing materials articulate their mission to spread the musical heritage, this is a quotation now, quote, the musical heritage which was created during the golden age of Jewish culture in Spain, end of quote, and who have produced many musical settings of Halevi's poems, including Yafei Nov, which we've already heard. They're known for publicized attempts to include Palestinian musicians in their activities, so using Al-Andalus as a bridge for a modern international crisis, right? The intercultural politics of the linked memories of Al-Andalus as chronotope and Yehuda Halevi as an embodiment of Zionist longing will come into fuller view a bit later. The geographical location of Israel-Palestine at the edge of the Eastern Mediterranean furthermore orients Israeli musical tastes toward the broader Mediterranean region. In the early decades of statehood, for example, the seaside city of Jaffa was predominantly a Palestinian city and home to clubs that famously hired visiting musicians from Mediterranean Europe during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Venues such as Cafe Ariana served as Israelis' musical links to the region and served as incubating spaces for the emergent Muzika Mizrachit, that's Mizrahi music, and Muzika Yam Tichonit, Mediterranean music genres. These genres themselves involve unapologetic pan-ethnic musical mixture involving Greek, Italian, Spanish, Arab, Turkish, and other styles mixed together with the developing body of Israeli folk song called Shirei Eretz Israel. Many of the songs from Spain, Greece, Italy, and elsewhere around the region became contrafacts with new Hebrew lyrics. Mediterranean currents furthermore intermixed, or I should say flowed into the broader establishment of global Israeliness via the popular music industry headquartered in Tel Aviv. A prime example of this was the inflow of musical currents from Latin America, sometimes via Spain and Portugal, stemming from the rapid globalization of tango, bossa nova, tropicalia, and other genres during the 1970s and beyond. Since the 1990s, a veritable craze around the incorporation of medieval Hebrew liturgical poems known as piyutim into popular music has effectively mainstreamed long-standing Sephardic traditions for audiences outside the synagogue across intra-Jewish ethnic orientations in Israel. In short, the mainstream of Israeli popular music has had an increasing appetite for Mediterranean styles since the founding of the state, as musicians were eager to claim these currents for the nascent national musical culture. Being that Israeli musical Mediterraneanism evinces a cosmopolitan ethic, it only stands to reason that Halevi's poetry would yield stylistically diverse modern settings. Let's explore this a bit with the time we have left. So let me see what's going on with my slides. Okay, I think this will work fine. So a striking, what I would call a Hispanicization of Yehuda Halevi is evident in a full album of settings of his poetry released in 2009 by Mizrahi singer Eti Ankri. Her version of Yefei Nof, like Nechama Hindel's 4-decade-old version that we already heard, draws on stereotypically Spanish musical gestures. While Hindel came from an Ashkenazi background from Central and Eastern Europe and was musically associated with that cultural formation through her performance and recording of Yiddish folk songs, Ankri came from a Tunisian Jewish family, and thus Sfarad would seem to be a more intimate point of reference for her. In some of her recordings, for example, she sings in the Arabic dialect of her parents and ancestors. So I'm going to guide you through the example we're going to listen to in just in a minute. So although there's no trace of flamenco or habanera patterning like Hindel's version, Ankri's setting draws on a Spanish musical lexicon to perform similar ideological work. The entire song follows what's called a 4-1-5-1 harmonic pattern characteristic of Spanish stereotyping. And if those of you who are unfamiliar with this way of looking at music theory, I think it'll be clear when you hear it. You've heard these chord changes before. And this proves to be the backbone of the rest of the arrangement, as it supports a vocal melody featuring a tidy descending motif and sequences derived from it throughout the recording. The overall arrangement and expressive gestures of accompanying instruments highlight the emotive quality of the text without resorting to the dramatization of poetic meaning in Handel's version. In arpeggiated nylon string guitar, which is a constant feature in a lot of these settings of Halevi, is present as a sonic signifier of Spanishness and a constant driver of the repetitive harmonic motion, while a lilting tremolo in the swelled accordion and clarinet punctuate the verses with a plaintive quality as they witness within the lyrics an exilic deferment of historical time, as in the poem's second line, "My soul longed for you from the edge of the west." Okay, so let's give this a listen, starting about 45 seconds in after a lengthy introduction on the original recording.
משוש תבל, קריה למלך רב, לך נחשפה נפשי מפאתי מערב.
As in Hindel's musical setting of the poem, the listener is meant to identify with Halevi's exilic position from a place of return. And this is made possible by transforming the poem through songful Mediterraneanism. Ankri emphasized this point during a 2011 concert at Bet Avichai in Jerusalem. She introduced the song in a long preamble discussing Halevi's Kuzari and his journey to Eretz Israel and Jerusalem, ending with a personal anecdote about ruminating on Halevi's longing for Jerusalem during a banal moment of driving to Jerusalem in her car. And those of you who have spent time there know that this kind of intersection, or this clashing of the sacred or the profound, the philosophical, with the banalities of everyday life in the city just happen constantly, right? That's what makes Jerusalem the city it is. And that's encapsulated in this story about Halevi. So whereas many Israeli musical settings of Halevi's poetry locate the poet in exilic Al-Andalus via musical images of Spain, and this is Christian Spain to be sure, that are intelligible to a globalized popular music audience, including Israeli listeners, other examples abound that do so by explicitly framing Halevi as part of a golden age of Andalusian cultural production that included contributions from Jewish, Muslim, and Christian creators. The convivencia, or coexistence myth, has endured since the mid-20th century as Jonathan Shannon, an anthropologist, writes, quote, inspiration for contemporary forms of multiculturalism, end quote, around the whole of the Mediterranean region, not only in Israel. What most of those disconnected or sometimes loosely connected musical projects around the region, sorry, there's a noise that got me, around the region, honoring shared elements of Andalusian culture have in common. So what they have in common is that they are implicitly framed by contemporary local and or global political circumstances. In the context of modern Israel-Palestine, the idea of a shared Jewish and Muslim Arabic poetic and musical heritage located within the poetics and performative modes themselves of Arab Andalusia presents for many musicians and audiences the chance to explore the possibilities of coexisting in the present, as I will discuss now. There was that last slide showing some examples of pulling from the Andalusian musical tradition in modern Israel, but we're past that now. Okay, so the most frequently performed musical setting of Halevi's poetry in its modern canonized form is Libi B'Mizrach, or My Heart is in the East. Its popularity is hardly surprising considering the fact that the poem has served since the rediscovery of Halevi's poetry in the mid-19th through early 20th centuries as a classic expression of what Barbara Mann calls, quote, the problem of Jewish geography, end quote. This problem is, according to Mann, as she writes, quote, the spiritual shock experienced by rabbinic Judaism living in the wake of the temple's destruction, distant from Jerusalem, end quote. The text of Halevi's poem is worth discussing for a moment. I'll give you a moment to read this yourself instead of me reciting it. The meaning of the distance expressed in this poem is commonly missed in the text's intertextual and musical careers. In other words, in its appearance in subsequent texts, often via musical settings. As the translator Raymond Scheindlin points out, there is no forward motion in this poem, for all its pairs are in, this is his quote, are in equipoise, East and West, Zion and Christians, Al-Andalus and Arabs, the wealth of Al-Andalus, and the ruins of the temple, end quote. Accordingly, he argues that the poem's balancing through adherence to the poetic form, the balancing of hemistiches, for example, and of the pairs of oppositions enumerated, suggests a stasis, quote, that is at odds with the calculation in favor of abandoning Al-Andalus for Palestine, end of quote. It is primarily a statement of the exilic condition in which Halevi found himself. In her analysis, Mann concurs with these observations, but adds an important insight. Quote, the distance in question is not necessarily geographic in nature and should be understood in messianic terms. The city that remains at the center of the poet's theological world, his heart, will also remain in physical ruins until some future time, end of quote. In other words, to play on Mann's prose, Halevi's poem expresses the emotional problem of distance, not a solution by means of migration, for the Jerusalem of his time was not the Jerusalem of his religious imaginary, as the text makes clear. But in the end, migration was a solution that Halevi himself chose when he set voyage for Palestine near the end of his life. So we have some sort of paradoxes, implied here between the text and the interpretations of it that we just went over, as well as Halevi's own choices he made with his own life. So there's some play available in there. Musical settings of My Heart is in the East often locate the poem and its sentiment in Al-Andalus according to a diversity of interpretations of the Andalusian soundscape. Nechama Hindel, coming up again, her rendition of My Heart is in the East, for example, would conform in some extent with the stylistic elements of her Yafei Nof discussed earlier, locating Spain predominantly in the harmonic motives and instrumental timbres. A version by Iranian-Israeli singer Rucham Raz does similar work, filtered through 1990s global popular music production techniques. Many other examples abound too. As I mentioned, it is the most popular Halevi poem for musical settings. Settings of the poem by Mizrahi-identified musicians sometimes differ from some of those gestures, using Arabic musical signifiers to express a longing for home that is torn between Israel and the places from which they or their immediate family migrated. Since piyutim began to mainstream in popular music during the 1990s and 2000s in Israel, and religious entertainment mixed with secular song, so too have vocalists, including Mizrahi-identified vocalists, achieved celebrity for their ability to reproduce this liturgical poetry in an Eastern style, drawing on their training in Sephardic liturgy and or in classical Arab music. These performances often take place on prestigious stages, such as the Israel Festival and the Piyut Festival, or else on televised music programs of various kinds. At the same time, over the past few decades, there's been a rise in the prominence of observant forms of Judaism, particularly forms of religious orthodoxy in the national consciousness, media culture, and political landscape. In 21st century Israel, therefore, singing rabbis, whether from Sephardi or Ashkenazi traditions, can achieve musical fame through similar channels to those used by pop stars. One such performer is Rabbi David Menachem, a prominent rabbi in Paitan of Iraqi descent who is a regular fixture in the programming described above and on the international festival circuit, particularly the cluster of festivals held each summer in Morocco. In addition to being a public figure in his capacity as a rabbi, Menachem is a musician who specializes in performance on Arab and Turkish musical instruments, primarily oud and ney. He rose to prominence during the night, and the ney is pictured with him right there, by the way. It's an in-blown flute, usually made of a reed. He rose to prominence during the 2010s for his mission to leverage both his religious authority and musical performance prowess as a platform for interfaith dialogue in Jerusalem. He regularly collaborates with Palestinian Muslim musicians, such as at the 2014 Sacred Music Festival in Jerusalem, where he and Sheikh Ghassan Manasra, a leader of the Qadiri Sufi order in Jerusalem, led a workshop comparing and contrasting cantorial practice and calls to prayer for the festival audience. A key to Menachem's peace-building strategy is his attempt to depoliticize religion itself in order to allow for examination of theological or ritual common ground between Jews and Muslims that are not overtly colored by the political crisis that serves as the context and impetus for such dialogue. Liturgical music is the chief site for this exploration, as he remarked in an interview with the Jerusalem Post daily newspaper. As he says, listening to a piyut is sometimes more important than listening to a sermon. You will always take the music with you. It will keep your heart open and ready to listen to the other. For Menachem, a deeper appreciation of Sephardic religious tradition presents the opportunity to engage seriously with Arab culture. And in fact, the Iraqi Jewish rabbi musician is seen in Israel as a broker of both. This strategy is borne out in his musical practice, including in his work with Yehuda Halevi's poems, such as My Heart is in the East. At a March 2015 performance during the Besod Kolot Rabim Piyut Festival, hosted by the National Library of Israel, which was meant to celebrate the proliferation of piyutim in Israeli popular culture, by the way, Menachem Alud and his performance partner Shlomi Shlaban on piano negotiated the cultural distance between Eastern and Western hybridized musical modalities based on maqam lami, an Iraqi musical mode. Melodically, the whole performance, across piano, oud, and voice, enforced a strong sense of modal center that placed it within an Arab musical logic. Now, here's what I mean. Often these kinds of hybrid musical performances tend to shift the power relation in favor of, to put it very reductively, East or West. And often so-called Eastern styles are sort of window dressing within a Western musical structure. Essentially, the inverse is true here, where the piano and its limited Eurocentric possibilities are assimilated to an Arab musical logic. That's what I'm getting at. So in the clip that follows, listen especially for moments of intensity as Shaban used his stiffened, elongated fingers to press octave-separated keys in loud, rapid succession in order to imitate the tremolo of the Arabic qanun, which is an instrument that's like a plucked zither, in clear signification of the Eastern Mediterranean style the musicians desired to produce. Let's watch and listen. I better stop there just in the interest of time, but this is a fantastic performance. I recommend you go check it out on Bet Avichai's YouTube channel. So if we had been able to continue through the whole performance, you'd see by the end of the song, the musicians transition directly actually into Yafei Nof, and the other text we've talked about today, marking the distinction not only textually, but with the entrance of a strict meter and a slight modulation to another maqam called maqam nahawand, which is again hybridized through harmonization with the piano. Now, I mentioned all this musical stuff because such negotiations of musical structure are characteristic of Iraqi Jewish musicians throughout the 20th century, figures of cosmopolitanism who served as arbiters of the modern Sharqi or Eastern style in Baghdad, and in turn introduced such hybridizations to Palestine, beginning with Ezra Aharon in the 1930s. In light of these gestures, and in the context of Menachem's well-publicized work on interfaith dialogue, the lyrics take on a less politicized meaning than in musical settings that employ a more superficial exoticization of exile, that is, through Hispanicization. Instead, this musical transformation of the lyrics does no less than suggest a solution to what Mann called the problem of Jewish geography, in the sense that it takes delight in the poem's lack of motion by locating the musicians' hearts in cosmopolitan Jerusalem, the space of its performance. The performers are not, as Halevi writes in the original, trapped in Arab lands, but rather trapped outside them, linking themselves to a memory of another home, now reachable only through imagination, through musical performance. So Israeli musical Mediterraneanism acts as a heteroglossic sonic signifier whose multiple meanings resonate in different ways depending on the context in which they function. In musical settings of Yehuda Halevi's poetry, this Mediterraneanism often functions as a signifier of temporary exile, retroactively casting Halevi's poems as prophecy to be fulfilled by Jewish settlement of Palestine in the 20th century. This we have seen in the Hispanicized settings performed by Nechama Hindel and others, where a range of Spanish musical gestures help to frame Halevi's place in Al-Andalus as an exilic condition. In other contexts, such as in settings by Rabbi David Menachem and other artists showcasing Mizrahi or Sephardi-identified musical traits, Mediterraneanism functions as an expressive attachment to multiple homes, in keeping with the poet's complex relation to space, east and west. Of course, there is plenty of aesthetic and ideological overlap between these different versions of Halevi, in which the poet is spatialized in terms of his distance from Jerusalem in Al-Andalus across the Mediterranean Sea. Sonically recasting Halevi into exile paradoxically affirms the bond between Jews and the territory of Eretz Israel and the bond between Jews and lands where they found themselves in exile, such as Al-Andalus and other Arab lands such as Iraq. These performances locate exile in the chronotope of medieval Al-Andalus and transport their audiences then and there in a manner that frames Halevi's poetry as a powerful attestation to a diasporic longing that could only have resulted in the eventual return of Jews to their ancestral land. In Jewish and Israeli modernity, Halevi's words echo through the corners of the very territory for which he longed in song. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your very interesting talk. And we have already several people who asked questions throughout your talk. And I would ask Yaron, maybe you can ask, I'll let you talk and ask your question directly.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for a great talk, Mike. I have several actually things, but I would like to ask you about your choice, and it's in the title of your talk, Mediterraneanism. You know, it's a loaded term, somewhat controversial, and even more specifically, it's I think a little bit problematic, not about the musical rendition of Yehuda Halevi, but his text. It's like the opposite of what I would think of the syncretism that is usually associated with Mediterraneanism, because everything is in binary terms, both about Spain versus the land of Israel, and when he talks about even Spain itself.
So you're asking essentially to explain this kind of, if you mind muting yourself, Yolon? Sorry, I'm echoing through your...
Yeah, I will repeat. So two parts of this question, two related parts for basically the same question. You have as part of your title, Mediterraneanism, right?
Yeah, I used the term throughout the talk. I don't think it was in the title, but
okay, yeah. I thought it was also but that's fine. Yeah, you use it throughout the talk, and I'm saying, you know, I mean, it's a very loaded term. Some find it even very problematic and controversial. So I just wanted you to explain your choice of the term, how you understand it. And I'm adding to that the common understanding of that it's exactly to kind of avoid any kind of clear identity markers or categorizations. Is to suggest some kind of syncretism, right? of many things coming together into something. And I'm saying that in the writing of Yehuda Halevi is anything but. I'm not talking about the musical rendition of his poetry, but he's basically talking about everything not as some kind of as syncretism and mutual influences, but either or. Everything is in binary terms. Does it make sense to you, my question?
Yes, it does make sense. And that's, that kind of, I think you mean a kind of a, not a syncretism per se, but a kind of a hybridity or mixture, something like this. And that's indeed why I use the term to indicate that all of these, there's a whole lot of other examples I could have pulled from to play for you. And I would in like a semester long class on this subject, for example, right? But these diverse stylizations of Halevi's poems participate in a broader. They are in. I look at them in conversation with each other, as well as a kind of a genealogy of an idea of a of Sephardic consciousness, Mizrahi consciousness, and the kind of interethnic détente that happens within Israeli cultural politics. And so that's a way of saying that this kind of mixture happens in the minds of musicians themselves when they bring together these disparate elements from, let's say, Spanish and Turkish and Iraqi styles that can appear alongside each other in the same song, or at least on the same album. Or because even folks who are engaging very deliberately with a particular identity, which you mentioned in your first iteration of the question, are still part of this larger phenomenon of setting Yehuda Halevi's poems according to this broad set of Mediterranean gestures. So I'm not suggesting that Mediterranean is a certain way so much as that it's a kind of an aggregate of the various types of musical settings that I've studied in this case. So yes, there's dissonance with Halevi, and that's simply because the idea of Mediterraneanism would not have been particularly salient in the time in which he lived. So this is about the interpretive moves that modern actors have made using his text as the foundational material.
So we have another question, which is really, we're changing gears here. Do you think that the historical and current romanticization of Al-Andalus and the idea of the accompanying golden age played a role in the 2015 decision by the Spanish parliament to offer citizenship to the Sephardic diaspora? And we're moving out of...
Yeah, so while I'm not a political scientist, 100% I think so. And I'm not saying this is on the part of Israeli musicians, like they sparked, a decision in Spanish parliament, but it's because Israeli musicians in their own way are part of a much larger Mediterranean phenomenon that I gestured to when I was citing Jonathan Shannon's work. I would look at his book, Performing Al-Andalus, if someone's really interested in this. Where in places like Morocco and especially in Spain, you have all this constant programming, cultural programming that's meant to promote this golden age vision, this convivencia myth around. And I call it a myth not because it's untrue necessarily, but because it's mythologized by all this modern activity. So when you go to anywhere in southern Spain, if you go to Cordoba or Sevilla, for example, there's just stuff happening all the time. There are institutions that are propped up. I went to, in Cordoba, a place called Casa de Sefarad, which was a museum and archive that is dedicated to all of this, to preserving the memory of Andalusian Jewry, which is completely run by Spanish Gentiles. Of course, part of what they say is, of course, none of us know if we're Jewish because of the Inquisition, which erased Jewry from the sort of nascent imperial and national, I won't say identity, but discourse. And so their stance is none or all of us could be Jewish or Muslim for that matter, but they have it's a very well funded. I asked about this when I interviewed the staff there. These kind of institution, this memory is institutionalized in Spain, and I think part of it is, of course, a kind of a they see it as reparative work for the violence of the Inquisition. And so this is part of what this is about. And so, yes, absolutely. That's the short answer to the question is yes. And this is some of the data that I have from my own research in Spain on this issue.
Musical terms here. Yeah, and Beth has another question about Yehuda Halevi uses Edom to describe Christian hands. Edom as a description of Esau, red and ruddy. I don't know how much you want to go into this.
It's a little bit beyond my expertise, I'd say, to really. I mean, I'm assuming that some of the participants here are much better qualified to address the biblical intertextuality in Halevi. But I will. The only way I can answer that is kind of in a more general sense, which is that the poetry operates on multiple registers of Hebrew simultaneously, which is part of what gives its power, especially in modern Israeli interpretations of the poetry, where after the modern revival and creation of Hebrew as a spoken language, these multiple registers were pulled from, by the Hebrew Language Academy and its various figures, pulling from the Tanakh and pulling from rabbinic literature, pulling from piyutim, medieval poetry, pulling from Arabic, the modern Hebrew itself has all these multiple registers built into its vocabulary and to some extent in its grammar. And so it's one, you see this happening in Halevi already. You can see how rich the language actually is of the poetry. So I understand why it resonates so strongly for musicians, especially musicians who are known for their wordsmithery, like some of the ones that I talked about today.
Yeah, so I think we're coming towards the end of our of the talk. Mike, I want to thank you so much for taking us to this journey into a different world and a different musical world as well. Thank you, every one of you who came and stayed until the end of this talk. And I wish everyone a very good night. And I hope to see you soon and hope very much that we see each other in person next semester.